The floor comes up fast. My mother's hip hits first. A gasp rips through the cabin. Someone screams. My hands are already moving before my brain catches up. Her eyes find mine, confused, scared, not understanding why the ground is suddenly sideways. She was blocking the aisle. The woman in the cobalt blazer says, "Not sorry, not shaken, annoyed." My mother's fingers grip my sleeve. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know what year it is. She only knows my face, and right now even that seems far away. I kneel beside her on airplane carpet that smells like recycled air and old coffee. My heart is a fist against my ribs. 20 rows of strangers are staring. Nobody moves to help. Nobody except me. The woman in blue crosses her arms like she's the one who's been wronged. Well, aren't you going to control her? My jaw tightens. My voice stays level because it has to, but somewhere behind my calm, something cold and final is beginning to form. She has no idea who just watched her push a 78-year-old woman with Alzheimer's onto an airplane floor. She has no idea what happens next. But to understand why this moment changed everything, I need to take you back to where this all began. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that 6 days earlier, I was sitting in a conference room in Geneva, listening to translators argue over the correct phrasing of a ceasefire clause, and I promised myself that the moment the session ended, I would fly home and take my mother somewhere warm. She raised me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio, worked 2 jobs, and never once complained where I could hear her. Now the woman who used to remember every constellation in the night sky sometimes forgot my name by dinner. The disease had been stealing her in pieces for 3 years. I wasn't ready to lose the rest of her without giving her one more good memory first. So I booked 2 economy seats to Miami under my mother's maiden name. No assistance, no detail, no title. Just a son and his mother, flying like anyone else. The airport that morning felt ordinary in the best way. Coffee smell drifting past the gate. A child laughing somewhere near the windows. My mother held my arm the way she used to hold my hand crossing the street when I was 5. And for a moment the years folded backward and it was just us again. The badge clipped inside my jacket pocket felt heavier than usual that morning, though I told myself it was only habit. We boarded early, found our row, and I tucked a blanket around her knees because she got cold easily now. She smiled at the window like it was the first sky she'd ever seen. For 20 minutes, everything was peaceful. Then boarding continued, and a woman in a cobalt blue blazer stepped into row 14 like she already owned it. She stopped at the overhead bin above our row and stared at it like it had personally offended her. Mid-40s, blonde hair sprayed into a helmet that didn't move when she did, a rolling suitcase clearly over the size limit, and heels that had no business being worn onto a 6-hour flight. Her blazer and trousers matched perfectly, cobalt blue, pressed, expensive, the kind of outfit that says I paid more than you and I want you to know it. She looked at the bin, looked at the flight attendant standing nearby, and said, loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear, "This bin is full. Someone needs to make room for my bag right now." The flight attendant, a young man with a patient smile that had clearly survived worse, offered to check her bag free of charge. "I don't check bags," she snapped. "Do you know how long that takes at baggage claim? Figure it out." He rearranged 3 other passengers' items without complaint while she watched, arms crossed, tapping one heel against the floor. It was a small thing, petty, forgettable thing, except it wasn't forgettable, because as the attendant finished, her eyes drifted down the aisle and landed directly on my mother's blanket-covered knees. Something shifted in her expression. Calculating, predatory. She had found her next target, and she hadn't even sat down yet. She settled into 14A, 1 row ahead, and spent the next few minutes complaining to no one in particular about legroom, about the smell of the cabin, about how first class had been a joke to even consider today, because apparently the app had shown a seat available and then hadn't held it. My mother, oblivious to any of it, asked me softly what time we would see the ocean. "Soon, Mom," I said. Soon. The plane finished boarding. The safety demonstration played, and that was when my mother, disoriented by the engine hum and unfamiliar seatback in front of her, unbuckled herself and stood up in the aisle, quietly asking a flight attendant if this was the bus to her sister's house. It was gentle confusion. Harmless. The kind of moment that happens every day to families managing this disease with patience and love. But the woman in cobalt blue turned around in her seat, looked my mother up and down, and said the first words she would ever say directly to us. "Can someone seat her? Some of us have places to be." The whole row heard it. My stomach dropped. I stood, guided my mother gently back into her seat, and murmured that everything was fine. We were almost ready to go. But cobalt blue wasn't finished. She leaned into the aisle, stared straight at me, and said, "Is she going to be a problem the whole flight? Because I did not pay for this." I kept my voice even. "She's fine. She has Alzheimer's. She just gets a little confused. I appreciate your patience." It should have ended there. Any reasonable person would have nodded, maybe softened, and turned back around. Instead, her mouth curled into something between disgust and triumph, like she'd found a loophole she could exploit. "That's not my problem," she said. "Maybe she needs a caregiver, not a plane ticket." A woman across the aisle gasped audibly. The flight attendant, sensing the temperature rising, stepped in immediately, keeping his tone professional. "Ma'am, I'll ask you to lower your voice. This passenger isn't bothering anyone." Cobalt blue rounded on him instead. "Excuse me? I paid for this seat. I did not pay to sit near someone who doesn't even know where she is." Another passenger, an older man 2 rows back, muttered something about common decency. She heard it and spun toward him too. "Mind your own business," she snapped, loud enough that 3 more heads turned. The attendant tried again, calm but firm, asking her to take her seat so the crew could complete final checks. She ignored him completely and kept her eyes locked on my mother like she was something distasteful tracked in on a shoe. I felt my hands tighten around the blanket in my lap. Every instinct told me to say something sharper, something final. But I have spent years learning that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one that wins it. So I breathed once, twice, and said nothing more. The seatbelt sign chimed. The plane began to taxi. And somewhere underneath my calm exterior, a small, quiet resolve was starting to take root. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into that particular hush long flights create. The low hum of engines, the occasional clink of a cart somewhere behind us. My mother had her forehead against the window, watching clouds slide by like something out of a dream she couldn't quite place. I let myself believe for a little while that we had weathered the worst of it. I thought about Geneva, about the translators arguing over a single word in a ceasefire draft, about how strange it was that, after a week of negotiating peace between nations, the hardest piece to keep was the one in a middle seat on a domestic flight. I thought about my mother's kitchen table 30 years ago, the one with the wobbly leg she never let me fix because she said it gave the table character. She used to tell me that the measure of a person wasn't how they treated people who could help them, but how they treated people who couldn't. I didn't know yet how many times that lesson would matter before we landed. For the first 40 minutes of the flight, an uneasy silence held. My mother dozed against the window, her hand loosely wrapped around mine. I thought foolishly that the worst had passed. Then the drink cart came through, and Cobalt Blue's tray table wobbled when the attendant set her ginger ale down, spilling 2 drops onto her sleeve. She reacted like she'd been burned. "Are you kidding me right now? This blazer is designer." The attendant apologized, offered a napkin, offered a dry cleaning voucher. She refused both and demanded to speak to a supervisor mid-flight, as though one could simply appear from the clouds. When told the purser would come by shortly, she twisted in her seat again, and her eyes found my mother, now half awake, humming a tune from decades ago that only she could place. "Can you make her stop that?" Cobalt Blue said. "It's giving me a headache." I told her, gently but clearly, that humming wasn't against any policy I was aware of, and that my mother wasn't bothering anyone. Cobalt Blue's face hardened. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." I asked carefully what she meant by that. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she raised her voice further, turning to the row behind her, trying to recruit sympathy. "Doesn't anyone else think this is ridiculous? We're all stuck listening to this." Silence. A woman 3 rows up shook her head slowly, clearly disagreeing but not wanting to engage. A teenager near the back had his phone raised, filming quietly, careful not to be noticed. A flight attendant passing through the aisle paused just long enough to catch my eye. A small, tired look that said she had seen this exact pattern more times than she could count, and that she was sorry there wasn't more she could do about it mid-flight. Somewhere behind us, a child asked her father in a whisper why the lady in blue was so angry, and the father simply said quietly, "Some people are like that, sweetheart. It's not about us." I filed that away too, the way I file most things without letting it show on my face. Cobalt Blue kept pushing. She flagged down a second attendant, insisting she be moved to a different row, insisting it wasn't safe to sit near someone unstable. My mother, sensing the tension without understanding its source, gripped my hand tighter and asked in a small voice if we'd done something wrong. That question broke something in me quietly, privately, in a way Cobalt Blue would never see. "No, Mom," I whispered. "We didn't do anything wrong." An older man leaned across the aisle and said, evenly, "Ma'am, she's not bothering anyone. Maybe you could just let it go." Cobalt Blue's head snapped toward him. "Nobody asked you." A younger woman near the window spoke up too, quieter but firm. "She's right. This is unnecessary." For a moment, Cobalt Blue was outnumbered, and something like fury flickered across her face at being outvoted by people she'd assumed would side with her. Rather than back down, she leaned further into the aisle, closer to my mother's seat than any stranger should ever get, and said the words that would replay in my mind for the rest of that flight. Maybe if her family actually cared, she wouldn't be allowed on planes at all. My mother flinched at the tone, even without understanding the words. I felt heat rise up the back of my neck, but I held it. I held it because I understood something Cobalt Blue didn't yet know. This was not, and would never be, a fight I needed to win with volume. The attendant returned with the purser, a composed woman in her 50s who had clearly navigated 1,000 versions of this exact scene. She listened, nodded, and gently informed Cobalt Blue that no seat changes were available, and that all passengers were expected to remain respectful. It was the correct answer, delivered the correct way. Cobalt Blue did not accept it. "This is unbelievable," she said, loud enough for the front galley to hear. "I want this documented. I want a refund." The purser, calm but firm, explained that a formal complaint could be filed after landing, and that for now, everyone needed to remain seated and calm for the remainder of the flight. Cobalt Blue's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump beneath her cheek. She sat back, arms crossed, glaring forward, and for a moment I genuinely believed it was over. My mother had drifted back into a light doze. The cabin lights had dimmed for the long stretch of the flight. I let my shoulders drop for the first time in an hour. That was my mistake, because Cobalt Blue wasn't done escalating. She was simply reloading, and what she would do next would turn a tense flight into something none of us on that plane would ever forget. The lull lasted almost 40 minutes. Then my mother woke suddenly, disoriented by turbulence, and in her confusion she reached for what she thought was her old kitchen chair, gripping the back of Cobalt Blue's seat to steady herself as she began to stand. It was an innocent, fumbling motion, the kind caregivers see constantly, the kind that requires patience, not punishment. Cobalt Blue whipped around like she'd been struck. "Do not touch my seat," she hissed. My mother, startled, gripped tighter instead of letting go, frightened by the sudden sharpness in the stranger's voice. "Get her hands off me," Cobalt Blue snapped at me, standing halfway out of her seat now, twisting toward us with real anger in her eyes. I stood immediately, gently prying my mother's fingers loose, murmuring reassurance, telling her it was all right, we were almost there. But Cobalt Blue wasn't finished. She reached out, grabbed the edge of the blanket still tangled around my mother's legs, and yanked it hard enough that my mother lost her balance in the narrow aisle. I watched it happen like slow motion inside a nightmare. My mother's hand slipped from the seatback. Her feet tangled in the blanket. And Cobalt Blue, instead of catching her, instead of stepping back, put both hands against my mother's shoulder and shoved. Not a stumble. Not an accident. A shove. My mother went down hard onto the aisle floor, her hip taking the impact, her confused eyes finding mine in the half-second before the pain registered on her face. The cabin exploded into gasps. Someone screamed. The teenager with the phone was already filming, hands trembling with adrenaline. I dropped to my knees beside my mother, my hands shaking now for an entirely different reason than fear. She was blocking the aisle, Cobalt Blue said, arms crossed, not an ounce of remorse in her voice. My mother's fingers found my sleeve, gripping tight, her breathing shallow with shock and confusion. "It's okay, Mom," I said quietly. "I've got you. I've got you." But inside, something had gone very still and very cold. Cobalt Blue looked down at us both like we were an inconvenience she was owed an apology for. "Well, aren't you going to control her?" she said again, louder this time, playing to the cabin. I rose slowly to my feet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You put your hands on a 78-year-old woman," I said. "On an aircraft. In front of witnesses." Cobalt Blue rolled her eyes. She grabbed my seat first. Every head in the cabin was turned toward us now. Nobody was on her side anymore, if anyone ever had been. And that was the moment I decided Karen had made the last mistake of her very comfortable life. The purser arrived within seconds, kneeling beside my mother, checking for injury with practiced hands while a second attendant radioed the flight deck. My mother was shaken but conscious, her hip already beginning to bruise beneath her slacks, tears sliding down a face that didn't fully understand why the ground had betrayed her. Cobalt Blue, sensing the mood of the cabin turning fully against her, tried a different tactic. She raised her voice, appealing to the crew directly. She was in my space. I have rights as a passenger too. The purser, kneeling, didn't even look up. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." Cobalt Blue refused, standing over us, arms crossed, insisting this was somehow being twisted against her. For one agonizing stretch of minutes, as my mother sat trembling on a folded blanket in the aisle waiting for ice from the galley, the crew was stretched too thin to fully address the situation, and Cobalt Blue used that gap to talk over everyone, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, insisting my mother had been the danger, insisting she be allowed to move seats immediately away from us as though she were the victim requiring protection. For a few humiliating minutes, it worked. The purser, juggling an injured passenger and an escalating scene with limited staff, told Cobalt Blue she could move to an open seat near the back simply to de-escalate the cabin. Cobalt Blue smiled, actually smiled, gathered her bag, and walked past us without a single word of apology, brushing past my mother's shoulder as she went. My mother flinched at the contact. I said nothing. I only watched Cobalt Blue walk to the back of the plane like she'd won something, and I let her believe it because I already knew how this story was going to end. I helped my mother back into her seat, wrapped ice from the galley into a cloth, and held it gently against her hip while she cried softly, not fully understanding why she hurt, only that she did. "Did I do something bad?" she asked me, and I felt my chest crack down the middle. "No, Mom," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong. Someone else did." She nodded, not really understanding, and closed her eyes again, exhausted. I sat with my hand over hers, watching the aisle where Cobalt Blue had walked, feeling the calm settle over me the way it always had in rooms far more dangerous than this one. I reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the edge of the credential I hadn't touched all week, the one I carried out of habit more than necessity. I did not take it out yet. 3 minutes later, everything changed. The purser returned to check on my mother, apologizing for the delay, promising a full incident report and medical attention on landing. I thanked her, kept my voice level, and asked one simple question. "Do you have security protocols for physical assault on this aircraft?" She paused, clearly surprised by the precision of the question, and said yes, of course, and that a report would be filed with the airline and local authorities upon arrival. "Good," I said, "because I intend to make sure this is handled properly." Something in my tone made her look at me more closely, though she said nothing. I asked if the teenager who'd filmed the incident would be willing to share the footage, and he nodded immediately, already forwarding the clip. I asked the purser to please note the names and seat numbers of the 3 witnesses who had spoken up earlier. She began writing without hesitation now. Word travels fast in a metal tube at 35,000 feet. By the time we were 40 minutes from landing, Cobalt Blue, sensing the shifting mood even from her seat in the back, made the mistake of walking back up the aisle to use the restroom near the front, passing directly by our row again. She paused beside me, looking down with the same contempt from earlier, and said, loud enough for nearby rows to hear, "I hope you're not thinking of making a big deal out of this. Things happen." She was in the way. I looked up at her slowly. My voice, when it came, was quiet, calm, final. "You shoved a woman with Alzheimer's onto the floor of a commercial aircraft," I said, "in front of a dozen witnesses. On video." Cobalt Blue's mouth curled into something ugly and dismissive. "And who do you think you are?" she said, loud enough that the entire section turned to listen. I did not raise my voice. I reached slowly into my jacket pocket. My fingers found the familiar edge of leather, worn smooth from years of quiet use, rarely needed, never wasted on moments smaller than this. I withdrew it and let it rest open in my palm, angled so the purser and the nearest rows could see it clearly. The credential caught the cabin light, the seal unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen it in a briefing room or on a news broadcast. Gasps rippled backward through the cabin like a current. A woman 2 rows up covered her mouth. The teenager lowered his phone slightly, stunned, then raised it again, faster this time. I spoke, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear, which made every word land harder. "I'm the Secretary General of the United Nations," I said, "and that woman on the floor 40 minutes ago is my mother." Cobalt Blue's face did not change all at once. It changed in stages, the way ice cracks before it fully breaks. First confusion, a flicker of disbelief, certain this had to be some kind of joke. Then her eyes dropped to the credential again, reading it a second time, a third, as though repetition might change what it said. Then the color left her face in a slow wave, cheeks going pale beneath foundation that suddenly looked too orange, too obvious. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She swallowed, tried again. I didn't. There's no way you would be flying in economy." Her voice cracked on the last word, high and thin, nothing like the commanding tone she'd used all flight. She reached for her earlier certainty and found it gone. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know if I had known." I cut her off with one sentence. "That's exactly the problem." The purser, standing just behind her now, had gone very still, her radio already halfway to her mouth. A man near the back said, quietly but clearly enough to carry, "She just shoved his mother onto the floor." Cobalt Blue's hands were trembling now, all her earlier fury replaced by something smaller and far uglier. Fear. She looked at me like she was seeing an entirely different person than the one she'd spent the last hour humiliating. And in a way she had never been looking at me at all. She had only ever been looking at what she assumed I was worth. The captain's voice came over the intercom less than 10 minutes later, calm and measured, informing passengers that upon landing, local law enforcement would be boarding to address an incident that had occurred during the flight, and asking everyone to remain seated with their belongings until instructed otherwise. Cobalt Blue sat rigid in her seat near the back now, no longer commanding attention, no longer demanding anything from anyone. She stared straight ahead, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cobalt blazer that had seemed so powerful an hour ago, now just fabric on a woman who had run out of leverage. When the wheels touched down, nobody clapped the way passengers sometimes do. The cabin was silent, waiting. 2 airport police officers boarded first, followed by an airline security supervisor with a tablet already recording notes. I briefed them directly, calmly, precisely, the same way I'd briefed delegations and cabinet officials for 20 years. I gave dates, times, seat numbers, and directed them to the teenager's video along with the purser's incident log. Cobalt Blue tried one final defense as the officers approached her row. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice thin now, stripped of its earlier fire. "She grabbed my seat," I reacted. "That's all that happened. Ask anyone." The officer glanced toward the cabin, where at least 6 passengers were already shaking their heads, and toward the phone footage already being reviewed on a nearby screen. "Ma'am, We have multiple witness statements and video evidence showing physical contact resulting in injury to an elderly passenger, the officer said. You are being detained pending formal charges. Cobalt Blue's composure finally broke completely. You don't understand who My husband is an attorney, he will. Nobody in that cabin cared anymore. One of the officers asked her to stand, and she fumbled with her seatbelt twice before managing to unbuckle it. Her hands no longer steady enough for a task she'd done 100 times without thinking. She looked back once toward my mother, as if searching for some flicker of the fear she'd been so certain she'd find there earlier, some final justification for everything she'd done. What she found instead was my mother watching her with mild, uncomprehending curiosity, the same expression she might give a stranger at a bus stop. No malice in it at all, because my mother had already forgotten most of the specifics of what had happened, the way the disease mercifully erased sharp edges within hours. Cobalt Blue seemed to understand, in that instant, that even the person she'd hurt most wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of visible hatred. That absence of drama seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. The officer read her rights as she was escorted up the aisle, past rows of passengers who watched her go without a shred of the sympathy she'd once expected as her due. Near the front, the airline's ground supervisor met me with an apology and informed me, clearly for the record, that Cobalt Blue was being permanently banned from the airline effective immediately. My mother, still seated, still holding the ice pack against her hip, watched the woman being led away without fully understanding the shift, but she felt the tension leave the cabin, and her shoulders finally relaxed. A few rows back, someone began to clap, quiet at first, then spreading, not for me, but for the moment finally reaching its end. My mother reached for my hand and squeezed it. Are we still going to see the ocean? She asked. My throat tightened. Yes, Mom, I said. We're still going to see the ocean. The cabin felt different once she was gone. Lighter somehow, like a held breath finally released. Paramedics came aboard to check my mother properly, confirming bruising but no fracture, and cleared her to continue with us once we'd filed the report. Passengers who had been strangers an hour earlier now leaned across seats to check on her. One woman offering a soft travel pillow, another simply resting a hand briefly on my mother's shoulder and saying, "You're safe now, sweetheart." My mother smiled at each of them the way she smiled at everyone now, warm and slightly puzzled, grateful without needing to know exactly why. The older man who had spoken up earlier caught my eye as we finally disembarked and said only, "Good thing you were here." I nodded, though I didn't correct him, didn't tell him that being here had never been about my title, only about being her son. I knelt beside my mother's wheelchair at the gate, straightened her blanket, and held her hand while we waited for a car. "You did nothing wrong today," I told her quietly. "None of this was ever about you." She patted my hand the way she used to when I was small and scared of thunderstorms, and for one clear, unclouded moment, she looked at me and said, "I know you'll always take care of me. Whatever else this disease takes from her, I decided right then, it will never take that." The airline arranged a private car for us at the gate, and a representative from the ground crew met us personally to apologize on behalf of the company, offering vouchers I had no intention of using but accepted graciously anyway, because refusing kindness offered in good faith felt like its own small unkindness. My mother dozed in her wheelchair while we waited, the ice pack finally set aside, her hands folded in her lap the way she used to fold them in church pews decades earlier. I remember standing there in the terminal, surrounded by the ordinary noise of an airport at midday, announcements over the intercom, luggage wheels clattering on tile, and feeling the strange quiet that comes after any storm finally passes. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated in the way I might have expected. I only felt tired and grateful, and aware in a way I hadn't fully let myself be aware of before, of exactly how fragile a good day can become in the hands of someone who has never had to consider the cost of their own cruelty. In the weeks that followed, the footage from that flight spread further than I ever intended, though I never sought that attention myself. Cobalt Blue, whose name the courts would later record as Diane Holloway, faced formal assault charges, a permanent flight ban across 3 major carriers, and a swift, quiet resignation from the community board position she'd apparently held with the same entitled ferocity she'd shown at 35,000 feet. Her husband, the attorney she'd invoked mid-arrest, did not appear at a single hearing. My mother's hip healed slowly, the bruising fading before the memory of the moment ever did for me. Though for her, mercifully, it faded within days, the disease erasing what it always erases. We did make it to the ocean 2 weeks later than planned. She stood at the edge of the water in a borrowed sun hat, laughing at the cold of it against her ankles, and for a few hours none of it, not the flight, not the shove, not the title in my pocket, mattered at all. What did come from that day, unexpectedly, was a policy shift at the airline itself, new mandatory de-escalation training for cabin crew when passengers with visible cognitive impairments are involved. Something the purser told me later had been needed for years and finally had the momentum to happen. A stranger from that flight, the young woman who'd spoken up early on, wrote to me months later to say that watching someone stay calm under real cruelty had changed how she handled her own difficult moments at work. I think about that flight sometimes not with anger, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because it reminded me that power means nothing if you can't use it gently, and that the truest test of who you are is not the title in your pocket, but how you treat the people who don't know it's there. There is a version of that day where I never reach into my jacket pocket at all, where the credential stays where it was, and Cobalt Blue walks off that plane believing she'd won, believing the world simply bends to whoever raises their voice loudest and longest. I think about that version sometimes too, not because I regret what happened, but because it reminds me how many people go through exactly what my mother went through with no one beside them holding any kind of leverage at all. No badge, no title, no video evidence spreading fast enough to matter. Just an ordinary son or daughter, doing their best, absorbing someone else's cruelty because the alternative felt like making things worse. I think about them more than I think about Cobalt Blue. My mother will likely never remember any part of that flight. Not the shove, not the officers, not the ocean 2 weeks later. But I will remember all of it, and I intend to carry it the way she once carried me, gently, and for as long as it takes. A year later, I keep a small photograph in my desk drawer from that trip, my mother ankle-deep in the tide, laughing at something only she could hear, sun hat crooked, completely unaware of everything that had happened to get her there. I look at it sometimes on difficult days, in rooms far more consequential than any airplane cabin, when the weight of decisions affecting far more people than one confused, gentle woman rests heavy on my shoulders. It reminds me why any of it matters at all. Not the titles, not the headlines, just the simple, stubborn belief that the vulnerable deserve protection, whether the person protecting them wears a uniform, carries a credential, or simply refuses to look away. Some people believe cruelty is invisible until someone powerful enough objects to it. They are wrong. Every act of unkindness is seen, remembered, and eventually answered, whether the person watching wears a title or simply wears patience like armor. My mother taught me that long before any credential ever did. If this story reminded you that dignity outlasts every ounce of arrogance thrown against it, you already know what to do next.